My name is Alex Lewine.
I'm JJ Reiner.
Our videographer today is Nick Horning, and we are interviewing John Lee Madden, Milwaukee resident, on December 15th, 2019.
So, Grandpa, what was your earliest childhood memory, would you say?
Say that again.
What was your earliest childhood memory?
Well, I'd say we moved 3-4 times on 66th Street back when we were kids.
So what was life like back on 66th Street?
Well, I was raised rather strictly, and I know once in a while I got out of line. My sisters always turned me in, so I didn't sit down much when my dad came home. That took care of it. So when I went in the Army, there was nothing to it. Did as I was told.
What was your probably most distinctive memory of Wauwatosa in general?
Well, it was a nice community, and they had Jacobus Park across the street where we could go ice skating. And when I was a teenager, I worked there for the summer while I was out of school for the summer vacation.
What was work like there?
Well, you'd mow lawns, and you'd have strange situations would come up. You know, in the summer, people would go to the park to have a picnic. And I recall one time when I had to pick up scrap paper and paper plates and that sort of thing. And I was at the extreme end of the park, which not too many people would visit. What did I see, to my shock, was a piece of lingerie from some lady, apparently, and a German meerschaum pipe, both on a park bench. So, working with other teenagers, we cast up the item of clothing up well above the path, and we had a lot of fun with that.
Is there anything else you would like to say about your growing up in Wauwatosa?
Well, we, of course, had many friends that also were in Wauwatosa, and we had teams like you would run into later on in high school, and baseball and football and that sort of thing. And it was a highly patrolled area. Police kept everybody in line, and it was a good place to live.
Sounds amazing. And besides like where you worked and obviously working at the park, was there any other place in Wauwatosa that you guys like to get together, whether it be to play sports or other activities?
Yeah, it was called City Park down on State Street, more in what we call the Village. And it was a nice spot. Our parents would use it. They had an ice rink in there where they did curling. They had a curling league. And so we had a good time there, played baseball. It was a good spot to relax.
Wonderful. And transitioning into your high school years at Marquette High, what was your opinion on the community during that time?
Well, I was a little worried about my record. But Father John J. Foley, SJ, took care of that. And for example, it came time during World War II when I was a senior, and I enlisted when I was 17, and I was called into service when I was 18 and a half, just what they say they do, and so that worked out real well, and it was a pleasant place to come from. In fact, when I was in service, I was stationed in Middleville, Illinois, so it wasn't really a hardship.
Are there any distinctive memories about Marquette that you think really defined your experience, whether that be as an underclassman or right before you enlisted in the Army?
They were pretty sharp individuals. There was Dave Foley and He was president of my class. In fact, it's interesting because his father, as my mother used to say, brought me into the world. And so later on, when I was at Marquette High, I got to know Dave. So, in other words, it was a high level of people that were going there, and I met a lot of people that came, attorneys or physicians. In other words, it's sort of a sharp group of people, I thought.
Do you believe that the faculty at Marquette University High School were supportive of you joining the war effort?
Well, I think the best example I have of that is Father Ulrich, who mentioned that as an option he would be offering Morse code. He said it could come in handy, and he was right about that. And so I took a little test when I went in, and I wound up as a radio operator in Chanute Field, Illinois. So that worked out very well.
Is there anything else you would like to add about your experience at Marquette University High School?
No, I know that we were loaded up with homework, and my grandsons have told me about that. And it was a serious bunch, and I think you get one of the best education you can by going to Marquette High. And I've had some people tell me, to them, it's the greatest high school in the country. And the thing that's a little unusual was I was only there 3.5 years, not 4. And that's where Father Foley came in. I said, what am I going to do, Father? I have to go in the Army. And February 14th, right in the middle of my senior year. He said, John, that wonderful training you will receive will count as the last half of your senior year. Just send me a report from your commanding officer, which I did, and I got my graduation.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So I felt they must have thought that I was worth it. At least he seemed to think so, but I was no outstanding scholar. But I guess it was good enough because I was exempt for the Latin exam anyway, so thank heavens.
So you said that you took Latin at Marquette High. Was that mandatory at the
Yes,
time?
2 years, yes.
Wonderful.
Is it any longer?
It is not mandatory
Oh.
right now.
I think you could take Greek at that time too, or there was some other language too. But that's the only language I took.
So one more thing about your high school experience. Since World War II was going on and there was an anti-German sentiment in the city, do you believe that had any effect on the Marquette community itself?
Well, I can tell you one example. Of course, being teenagers, somebody went a little too far, and somehow his brother was in service, and he got a hold of a huge Nazi flag. And at that time, there was no expressways in Milwaukee, and everybody going to work downtown went right down Wisconsin Avenue, right past 3401 West Wisconsin, the site of Marquette High. And he set up this flag by opening some windows. I'd say the flag was about 8 feet long and about 4 feet high. And then he slammed the window down on one end. And in other words, he put it up as on a display. So people going to work would look at Marquette High and see a Nazi swastika and say, man, I don't know whatever happened to that fellow, but it was kind of interesting. But I didn't think there was any extra talk about anti-anything at Marquette High then.
While looking at your service in the military, you mentioned you were stationed at a radio base. What was your primary job at the base?
My base was it was a military version of the civilians had same thing today. It was a flight service station, and they were all over the world. In other words, let's say a military plane took off from Omaha and was flying on a trip to Cleveland, and this is the days before radar, and so to stay in touch with the people on the ground, he would call in to stations like I was at. at this little town of Rantoul, Illinois, which is about 30 miles north of Champaign, I'd say. But anyway, we would correspond with these people after going through radio school at Scottsfield down near St. Louis. And the strangest call I got was one night about 2 a.m. when I got a call saying this is Army 4061, the Green Hornet. And I thought, who is this wise guy anyway? And well, he wasn't in a mood to laugh or anything. He said, you've got to contact Washington, D.C. We left a briefcase, a very important briefcase, in the men's room in Washington, D.C. before we took off. And it's very important that we locate this briefcase. So 2 years later, well, no, right then I should tell you what happened. He asked me to get on the teletype, contact Washington, see if he could go to the men's room and find this briefcase, which they did. And I let him know, and you could tell the relief in his voice, faint as it was. He was getting farther away from me. Thanks a lot, Chanute. Well, 2 years later, I'm out of the Army. I'm reading a Collier's magazine that the Army set up their own airline between Washington, D.C. and Alamogordo, New Mexico, which was a site for atomic bomb work of some kind. And they called their airline the Green Hornet Line. And I've often wondered what was in that briefcase. Of course, I'll never know.
So what would you say is was your favorite part about working at that radio station?
Well, the fact that I had no problem with Morse code, thanks to Father Ulrich, and I was able to, I had no problem working there and doing the work, and it was a very, very nice job to have. And we were working 9 days with split shifts around the clock, and then a 3-day pass to Milwaukee. And so every 9 days I was going home on pass, so I can't really complain. I was walking down the street one day after my shift going back to the barracks, and a WAC, which is the Women's Army Corps, stuck her head out of an office window and said, Madden, get in here. We're looking for volunteers. So I said, well, keep looking. And I kept walking. About 2 seconds later, a man was staring out the window who had some silver symbols showing he was a captain. And he said, Madden, get in here. So yes, sir, I went in there. And it turned out he was looking for people to volunteer to go on something called Project Survival. So I wound up going to the Azores, which are a group of islands 900 miles off Portugal, for temporary duties of 60 days. And I ran a teletype, and so that was my overseas duty, which I enjoyed very much.
When thinking about other experiences while in the Army and having that chance to actually go back to Milwaukee during wartime, was there anything that stuck out to you about Milwaukee itself during World War II?
Well, the thing that stuck out more than anything were when I would be home, I would go over to 68th and Wells and do shopping, grocery shopping for my mother, and every time I'd see the same lady, what, you home again? I just got a letter from Eddie. He's been in New Guinea for 3 years. So they were kind of jealous of me, I think, and it didn't bother me too much, though. That's the way I was scheduled, and that's the way I reacted. And that was just her attempt at humor, I think. But I was very fortunate when you think of all the problems it could have had. But I was in what was called the U.S. Army Air Forces, and in 1947 it was set up as a separate service, and it was called the U.S. Air Force ever since.
Wonderful. Is there anything else you would like to add about your time working in the Army?
Well, I know I could have signed up when it came time to go home. My mother and a friend came down to pick me up, and they told me in the military office, now Madden, if you want, I was a sergeant then, and they said, we can make you a staff sergeant, which is the next step up from a promotion. And as a private then, you got $50 a month. And as a sergeant, you got $100 a month. But as a staff sergeant, I would get 120, I think it was. And I said, well, he said, you only have to stay in 60 days longer. And my father had constantly giving me advice. And he said, whatever you do, don't volunteer for anything. So I took his advice. And I said, I don't think that's necessary. I can go home now, right? He said, well, that's right. I said, goodbye. So that took care of that. I did have something happen many, many years later. When I was in the Azores, I ran into another fellow who was in a station like mine in Illinois, and he was out in Iowa somewhere. And he and I climbed a mountain there in the Azores, and we were good buddies, played ping pong in the USO and stuff like that. So I got to thinking, I wonder if that guy's still around. So anyway, I did hear that he was thinking about going to Washington, D.C., and that's where he lived. He did move there, and he didn't stay in Iowa. And I got a hold of his sister, and I couldn't talk to him. He wasn't there, but she called me 3 weeks later because I had a picture in my desk of him with me, and I thought he might like it. She said he was very pleased with that, showed it to all his friends, but that was about all that happened. About a week later, he passed away, so anyway. It was a grand experience, you know. I was in 20 months and 3 weeks and have no complaints.
Wonderful. So when thinking about your experiences after the war, you went and studied engineering at Marquette University.
That's correct.
Okay. And what would you say that experience was like, being so close to home at college?
Well, after I left Marquette High, I got off the track of studying properly, and the engineering was too much for me. So that's how I got involved in aviation on my own. I had enlisted when I was 17 in the aviation cadet program. In other words, you learn how to fly and that sort of thing. But they didn't need any pilots then, and the war was almost over. So.
And so what would you say really sparked your interest in aviation?
Well, my uncle, my dad's brother, was a pilot in Milwaukee and out at Mitchell Field, and he told me stories during and I just decided it'd be a good idea to learn how on my own, which I did. And I worked for an insurance company as their pilot, flying them around, and the Midwest usually. I had some very interesting people that we acquired what's called an air taxi certificate, where you will report to the FAA every 6 months. If you pass a written test, an oral test, and a flight test, you can fly for another 6 months. So every 6 months you were at the hands of the FHA. But I had people like, who was that senator from Arizona, Barry Goldwater. And I went up to pick him up on Green Bay and took him down to O'Hare Field so he'd catch a flight back to his home state. And I had Vanna White, who is on a program today, a TV program called Wheel of Fortune. And that was extremely unusual because obviously I was the only pilot. It wasn't a big organization. And to get a call from a radio station here in town, and how much would it cost to pick up an individual in California and bring that individual to Milwaukee? And I found out, and he said, well, you're going to take this person to a circus museum in Baraboo. And her connection with doing this and with Milwaukee was Milwaukee's great circus parade that many people remember down Wisconsin Avenue. She was hired to sit in an enclosed area outside of the Pfister and comment about each great circus parade going by, all the old circus wagons. And she went up to Baraboo to make a strip of it. Hi, I'm Vanna White. Tune in for the Great Circus Parade on next Sunday. Well, they took 13 takes before they got anything that satisfied the people. And one was baby crying, motorcycle, lady, get out of the way, we're doing a commercial. And finally, I was looking over Vanda's White and munching on a sandwich and about 50 feet away, and she noticed me. And what I was looking over her head was the black sky. In other words, the weather was deteriorating. So she said, if you got to get me back to Los Angeles tonight, I've got to be there. I said, well, then we better get going. So we did. And little things like that. I met a lot of interesting people.
So staying on the topic of famous people, in any time while living in Milwaukee, did you interact or come across any people you would consider notable?
Well, yes, I took, I took the governor of our state. He was a good friend of an executive at the insurance company where I was pilot, so I took him around quite a bit. And of course, Vanna was pretty important. And when I went out to see my sister in California, I managed to get a ticket to her show, and I saw her again. And I sort of got carried away because she met us in a vacant corridor and was my cousins. And she held out her hand to shake my hand, and I just gave her a big wraparound hug, which upset her. And I got a glare from a man who was obviously her bodyguard, but then no one said anything. So yes, I did meet people that were quite notable, and I met several police officers who went over to Michigan to pick up 2 prisoners. The other people that are a little more notable were other federal senators, and I took the fellow who broadcast the baseball games for the Brewers, and also the one who broadcast for a TV station, was University of Wisconsin games. I took him to all away games. I had a seat on the 50-yard line, stuff like that. I just had a good time.
You mentioned in our pre-interview that you had a momentary encounter with Carl Zeidler before he went off to war.
That's correct. Again, when I was cleaning out my desk, he was at some civic celebration during World War II down at the lakefront, and he was leaving to go back to duty. He was an officer, a U.S. Navy officer on a freighter. And what they did, they had a gun emplacement on many freighters taking supplies to England. And I happened to snap his picture, and probably the last picture anyone took of him. I just still have that. I should have given it to his brother, but I never did. So.
Wonderful. And you talked a little bit earlier in the pre-interview about how you actually ended up flying for a funeral home.
That's correct. That's what really got me going, until the head man said, "Why are we flying around on this little airplane? Why don't we get a bigger one so we can take the deceased along with several members of the family?" Which we did, and I moved up to a bigger plane, and it was fine with me. We could take the seats out on one side, and we could put the casket on one side and 3 members of the family, and they enjoyed that very much. It's just like another customer I had that had a factory. He had one in Milwaukee and one in Indiana. And so every Christmas, he said, "John, take the seats out the right side there, all the seats in the back." And it's only a 6-seater plane, but he'd filled it with ham. And then we'd go down to this plant in Illinois, and he'd have a walkthrough with all the employees, and he even gave me a ham. So I'd haul parts. I had a call from a man. I could hardly understand him. He was from Yugoslavia. He was over in Muskegon. One of his pumps went out on his ship. He was coming over to Milwaukee. He wanted me to come over, and they'd give me the pump, which was a huge salt-stained thing. Must have weighed 500 pounds. But I took it over back to Milwaukee, and they fixed it so that when he finished his business in Michigan, he could come over and not waste any time. He went on his way. There's stuff like that I know the police were upset when we came back. I picked them up at Mitchell Field, and they went over to get these prisoners, and I was a little leery of that, but we couldn't land at Mitchell Field coming back, so I didn't say anything to them. And the weather was too soupy, so I went over to what was called Curtis Wright Airport on the north side, now Timmerman. And they were suspicious of me. They said, "Wait a minute, we didn't take off from here." And I said, "Well, I had to explain it." And I said, "What's wrong with those guys anyway? Why are you picking them up?" "Well, they were divorced people that did not make payments." I said, "Okay." So I thought they chained them to the seats or something. So it was a very interesting job. And I know one time I took a body up to Sturgeon Bay, and I was told after that I was told to pick up a Milwaukee individual that passed away in Michigan. So just continue over there after I left Sturgeon Bay, which I did. And en route, crossing Lake Michigan, I got a controller sitting in a windowless room down in O'Hare Field nearby. And he said, "If you look out the window about 2 o'clock, you'll see something interesting." So, well, of course, as a good pilot, you're always looking out the window. And pretty soon I saw it, a big 8-engine B-52 bomber. He passed right under me. No problem, no danger, because we were both in touch with the controller. But it was quite an experience, stuff like that, and made it interesting.
Awesome. Is there anything else you would like to add about your time as an aviation pilot?
Well, friends of mine told me I should write a book, no one would believe it. And I said, well, that's why I had pictures taken of me with Vanna, because no one would believe that I had Vanna White and took her anywhere, But no, it's, well, the only thing I'd like to say is, as far as training, I was very big on training. And because every 6 months I'd have to take another test, and I always went up with my instructor every month, and he'd do things like, when we got the twin engine plane, he'd pull back the power on one engine without any warning. Usually after he dropped a pencil to distract me. In the automatic reaction, anybody drops a pencil, you look for it, But he said, "John, what is the number one thing in aviation? Fly the damn airplane." I said, "Yeah, that's right. I always remembered that." And I think they should have stressed that more. Some people get their license and then they never go back for a refresher.
Wonderful. So we talked about in the pre-interview how you drove trucks for the Journal Sentinel.
That's correct. You had to be going to school, university, and I worked for the Journal for 20 years part-time. And I just worked weekends, of course. I was what was called state delivery, where you didn't drive one of the panel trucks around town. You drove to different points in the state, delivering the daily paper. And it was a great bunch of guys. We really had a great time. And sometimes there'd be a special section, you drive all night. And I know 2 babies were born. One was almost born when I was stopped out on the highway and late at night going to Madison. And I said, "I can't help you with that." And the guy said, "It's my daughter-in-law." And I said, "Well, I'll guide you to a filling station, but I can't do any more." There's odd things like that happen, And we had a good time doing that, though.
Okay. Is there anything else you would like to say about driving trucks?
I think it was a great, great way for people to be able to afford going to school, and that was the Journal's requirement, that you must be going to school. Finally, they said, so many of us were staying there after we left school that, like me or someone that graduated, that They didn't even want to work weekends. They said those who were there then could stay, but no one else could. After that, once you out of school, you can't stay. So they had quite a group there then, especially after they took the Sentinel over. They were going day and night. So.
Did you meet anyone famous or like influence while you drove trucks for the Journal?
No, there's people who I could name that became attorneys. One was the attorney for the Teamsters Union. Oh, I can tell you one notable person I took, Bobby Kennedy. His brother was running for president, and when I was working at the airport then, after I got my ratings and everything, I got a call over the radio. I was working behind the desk then, and I wasn't flying charter then. And this was Bobby Kennedy returning from a trip with Mrs. Fitzgerald, his aunt, for his brother. And his brother and wife were there. They chartered 5 planes. But the thing is, they wanted a ride back downtown, and they wanted to know if I could call them a taxi for them. I said, sure. So I had Bobby and his aunt, and he said, well, this is awful nice. You give me I thought, why should I get a cab when I'm going downtown to to drive the journals out to Madison tonight, and going downtown anyway. So he's awful nice of you to give us this ride, and I said, that's all right. I work for a newspaper in town part-time. Oh, he said, are you an editorial? And I said, no, I drive a truck. Well, at this time, Bobby Kennedy and a union leader were at each other's throats, and he got a little discouraged. He said, well, then you're a Teamster? And I said, no, I'm not a Teamster. We're not any involved with that at all. But I calmed him down, and that was kind of interesting, meaning he was a notable guy. So.
So once you got out of college, and you started like in between driving trucks and flying airplanes, were there any hobbies or places in Milwaukee that you'd like to visit?
I did work at the Lattice Company for a while, but they had sort of a recession and I was laid off, and that's what got me into aviation, and also knowing of the funeral director, that helped, and he was looking for somebody to help him fly his airplane, and I know it's a very interesting job. You were your own boss. Several people, I didn't take them. For example, I took this fellow who broadcast football games of the Badgers and others, and we were in Minneapolis, and we got up there okay, and to Minneapolis, but going back, and when I checked weather, there was icing. And if you have icing, that can affect your flying. And in fact, the best example I have is of that. This fellow that I mentioned, who broadcasts the Milwaukee Brewers baseball games, Bob something or other, I forget what his last name was. He called me one day, and he said, I want to go down to Notre Dame. This is in January. And I said, what are you going to do down there? Well, we got to go, 2 people want to go to a game down there. I told him I'd take him, we'd charter a plane and go down there. And it was at night, and I knew what it'd be like. It was a bitter cold day. And naturally, after the game, around midnight, we went back to the airport at South Bend. And guess what? The airplane is sheathed in frost, heavy frost. Now, frost can affect your lift, and many times people take off anyway. I always carried a big gallon jug of de-icer fluid. So I opened the doors, the 2 people got in the plane, the wind is blowing, it's a bitter cold night, and Bob is standing there watching me. He said, what are you doing? I said, I'm sloshing this de-icer fluid and cleaning off my wings and my tail, and so that we can safely take off, because otherwise it was a clear night, you know. So he said, I'll give you a hand. I said, okay. So I pulled out some towels, and he said, where'd you get those towels? I don't have towels like that in my bathroom. I said, well, that's all right, just as this will keep it safe. So we took it all off, and we got back to the plane as we walked around it. And I did one wing and the tail, and he did the other. And I saw the doors were wide open. I had left them open. And I just said, oh, what a dummy I am. I left it open. Those guys must be frozen in there. He said, what? The hell with them? You and I are out here working. So I always got a laugh out of that. So, but that's the kind of stuff I think should be encouraged more in training. More training every once in a while, and just remember, always have de-icing fluid.
So you mentioned the Milwaukee Brewers.
Yeah.
What was it like when they came to town?
Well, I didn't see any effect on my, as far as any connection with them, except the other thing, like football, when I flew that fellow to broadcast. But as far as baseball, it didn't really affect my business.
So earlier in the pre-interview, you talked about experiences with the electric streetcar. Is there anything you would like to say about those, or any opinions on those?
Oh yeah, I had a very efficient setup attending Marquette High School. My father was sales manager at a place called the Edwards Motor Company on 36 in Wisconsin, Dodge Chrysler Plymouth dealer. So he'd always give me a ride to school every day. But when I'd go home, I'd have to take the streetcar. And there were some guys that were kind of rowdy types that I went to high school with, not too many, but they liked to pull stuff, like turning off the lights in the showers and throwing snowballs at streetcars. And one group of guys, just a couple of them, they weren't hoodlums or anything, but they like to disconnect the streetcar power by when they get off at their stop. They disconnect. They pull with they had a rope connected to the boom that went up to take the current to keep the thing going. And so I didn't really have too much to do with streetcars, except it got me home every night after my day at Marquette High.
So going back to your childhood,
Yeah.
You said you spent a lot of time in Fox Point. What was that like?
That was Fox Lake, yes.
Fox Lake.
Yeah, that's a little town about 70 miles north west of Milwaukee, Fox Lake, Wisconsin. It's near Beaver Dam, and that's where my folks are from. And they had two interesting parents, and I knew all four of my grandparents until I guess they started passing away by the time I was in the Army. But anyway, one taught me how to drive a 29 Dodge is what he was driving, and he took me over to the community building where people could rent it for weddings and things like that, and parties. And one time I found out that Grandpa taught me how to drive in the parking lot, no problem. He got tired of going to the parking lot all the time. So he took me to Beaver Dam, only I drove. Well, unfortunately, I had an encounter with the police. As I was driving down the road, I noticed a county sheriff parked in a farmer's driveway. And he came after me and informed me that I had better have a license next time he stopped me. So, needless to say, my grandfather drove us home. But anyway, in connection with that community parking lot, being during the wartime, it was before I went in service, obviously, but I could sit on the second floor of my grandpa's house with binoculars, see German prisoners of war walking around. They had fenced in the community center, and the German prisoners of war were used to run a gigantic canning factory in Fox Lake. And of course, there's nobody around to work in the canning factory because everybody's in the Army or somewhere. So they used them to, that was kind of interesting to see them only a block away. And my other grandfather was a very sharp guy. They grew up during the times when to illuminate your home, you had to use a gasoline lantern, a kerosene lantern, I think they called them. But then electricity came in. And just before everybody got excited about electricity, they used gas. They piped natural gas to homes to lighting. And that's the way things went. And my grandpa on my mother's side went to places like North Chicago and Portage, and he put up gas power plants. And he also built trucks. I don't know how I was pretty young then, I didn't really look into it, but he built heavy-duty trucks. And so it was an interesting life. My father's father was a retired farmer, and so anyway, I had a pretty good time for vacation before I was working in the park or before I got older.
Did any notable stories happen that you can remember?
Well, I know that my mother's brother, whose name was Percy Draper Pettigrew, he was not happy with his name. He was a big guy, and he preferred using his middle initials, P and D. D is for Draper, which is an old family name. Well, one day he got a hold of my father, and he said, I got a good idea. I got a croquet ball, and I sprayed it, told my dad, I sprayed it with black enamel paint. I drilled a hole, and I put a dynamite fuse in it. He said, well, what are you going to do with that? He said, well, let's take a walk uptown. So they went uptown. It was a Saturday afternoon in summer, and he threw that through the doors. He just opened the doors, and there was a table full of people playing cards inside, and it bounced in there. Well, unfortunately, everybody thought it was a bomb, and they went out the back door. And one poor individual was subject to fits, and he would just be there to watch him play. Well, he had a fit, and he was writhing on the floor. Finally, they said, wait a minute, that fellow, I know that fellow. He's a rascal. In fact, one of the teachers called him a name one day, and she called him an imp of Satan. So they didn't think much of my uncle. And anyway, there were a lot of strange things going on there in Fox Lake. In fact, one time I decided to take my little box camera and right while everybody was having supper, climb the community water tower and take pictures just to prove that I had done it. And all I did was get pictures of housetops, but I did that, but I didn't do anything worse than driving without a license when I was 10 years old.
Is there anything else you wanted to say about Fox Lake or any of those experiences?
Well, one terrible thing happened right when I was on vacation one summer. The canning factory caught fire. And being a little kid, of course, this was a big, big thing because they had fire trucks there from Beaver Dam, Randolph, some even came from Slinger, and I don't know where all. And that to see this fleet of red trucks and feverishly working on a fire, that was a big thing for a little kid. And I got a big kick out of that. But you look at things differently. You don't worry about stuff, things like that when you're a kid.
Okay, great. Earlier in our pre-interview, you talked about a certain encounter with Bart Starr's wife.
Oh, yes.
To elaborate on that.
Oh, yes. The fellow who was a broadcaster for the Packers, as well as Wisconsin, called me at home one day and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Nothing." I said, "Okay, tomorrow, you available?" "Yep." He said, "We got to go up to Green Bay and interview Bart Starr's wife." I said, "Okay." So we got up there and I rented a car and we go out to Bart's house, and he wasn't there, but his wife was. And so the broadcaster introduced me and introduced the cameraman, and she was very gracious. She was just loved by all the Wisconsin fans. Very nice lady. Well, when I was introduced, the smile disappeared, just like somebody had pulled on a light shade or something. And she said, well, I know John Madden, and you're not John Madden. And I thought, what's the matter with her? And I was such shock that I didn't do or say anything or pull out any ID or anything. And on the way home, well, before that, while I was still there, they hadn't even started the interview. And finally, the interviewer said, John, why don't you take that tennis ball and play with the dog outside with the dog? I said, yeah, okay. So I was puzzled by this, and I don't know, I wasn't thinking. I should have pulled out an ID or something. But on the way back to Milwaukee, I'm flying along, I thought, I know what it was. Today's Tuesday. 2 days ago was Sunday. Guess who came to Green Bay and played the Green Bay Packers? John Madden and the Oakland Raiders. John Madden was a huge man, almost 300 pounds. He just happened to have the same name as I did. She thought I was a wise guy, rubbing it in because they pounded the Packers right into the ground. And so that was the solution for that. I did have some into some people that were suspicious of that name. They thought I was kidding.
So, Graham, what was it like meeting your wife?
My wife was a roommate of my sister, and so they both attended the University of Wisconsin, and so that's how I met her. And so that's got me on the bandwagon and started my dating. I didn't do much dating or dances or any of that stuff until I was up in my 20s or something. And, so that's how I met her.
And after meeting Elizabeth, were there any places in Milwaukee you guys liked to visit?
Well, just the usual, movies, and we'd go up to Door County with my sister and do a little traveling, My dad being in the automobile business, I had my first car when I was in my 20s. It was a 50 fire engine red Dodge convertible. So that was kind of fun having that. And one time I came back from a journal run, and I had parked my car in the journal garage where they keep all their trucks. And as soon as I turned the key, I knew something was wrong because I heard a piercing whistle followed by an explosion. Somebody had wired one of those joking bombs in my car. And so when I put the hood up to check and see if there's any damage, I had undercoating, real thick, that you could put your fingernails into. None of this paint job. It was Edwards Motor Company put it on as an option. And there were bits of paper with Japanese writing on it, I know. And, the mechanics had done that. They had fixed up my car just to give me a kick.
That's awesome. Is there anything else you would like to say about your early dating experience?
About what?
Your early dating experience in Milwaukee, or with your wife?
Well, I guess I was kind of shy then, and I didn't get married till I was in my 40s, but I did the right thing. I married the same girl. I went to a lot of different girls because I was single, and I just wasn't ready. So I know that my friends all got married in their 20s, and I just had fun and went out, and so to me there was no rush. So she was a school teacher, and so we got along good.
Oh, going back to your childhood days, what was it like going to grade school at Jefferson?
Oh yeah, that was in Wauwatosa, and the main thing was that we walked everywhere, rode bikes, and I think we got a good education there, and worked out good. And but when it came time to go to high school, there was a fellow, Nick Gagliano, and my dad sold him trucks and he was in the vegetable and fruit business, and so his son went to work for my father, and he said, I know your son. Now he's ready to go to high school. Why doesn't he go to Marquette High instead of Tosa? So he talked my father into that. That was kind of a shock because I didn't know anybody at Marquette High. And but am I glad? It was one of the major points in my life to go to Marquette High School, let me tell you. They taught you how to study. And the only trouble I had was when I was away in the Army, I sort of lost that, so that when I came back, I went to engineering school, and I wasn't back on the track, and I could see I wasn't making it, so that's how I got into aviation.
Is there any interesting stories at Marquette High that you remember?
Well, outside of the Nazi flag, you know, the usual teenage mischief, you know. I could tell you one story, a classmate of mine, Terry Brennan. Terry Brennan, I don't remember what kind of work he went into, but I think he worked somewhere down around Chicago. But he was a coach at Notre Dame, and he was a player, a football player. His older brother, Jim, was a star when he was going to Marquette High. But one time, his father and mother went down to Notre Dame. They wanted to see their son playing football. They were playing against Army at Notre Dame. So, wouldn't you know, his mother decided, just as they were walking to the stadium, she wanted to take a tour of the campus. He said, well, we got to get going. The game's going to start. Well, we'll see it. We'll get in there. All of a sudden, the game did start while they were on their little tour. Tremendous roaring of the crowd, just tremendous. And it went on and on. He said, what happened? And he ran to the stadium and he talked his wife into going. He said, what happened? He said, didn't you see it? Terry Brennan ran back the kickoff for a touchdown. And I think his father was rather cool towards his mother after that. They never saw it. So that was kind of, I've seen him at reunions. He was a great guy. Terry was a great guy. And as most of the Marquette High people were. And so anyway, we went our separate ways, and that's the way it went. Some good, some bad.
You had mentioned in our pre-interview that you had an interesting encounter in science class.
Oh yes, we had the subject was biology. This is during the war, and we had a little gnome-like fellow that we called Bugsy, and he was sitting slumped behind the laboratory table where he conducted his class, and the bell rang, the final bell to get going. He didn't start. He just sat there slumped, and somebody, what's wrong with Bugsy? Is he dead? You know, what's wrong with him? Finally, he came up with his guttural voice, some jackass parboiled the frogs. He was mad as a hornet. What had he done? He had ordered a shipment of frogs in a big wooden box, and he was going to give each of us a live frog, and we were to take it home, and we had been given dissecting outfits. We were to produce the skeletal framework of a frog put on a stained roof shingle. And the highest grade would be the one that picked the carcass clean. In other words, the only thing left was the skeleton of the frog mounted on the shingle. He was mad because when the shipment arrived, he had gone for the day, and some strange student had seen this box in the sink, in the lab sink. So he turned on the hot water and went home. So the frogs were cooked in this crate. And the next morning, Bugsy comes to work, and here the frogs are all dead in various contortion, various odds. Well, they were in difficult positions. He said, you chaps are paying the penalty. You will not be able to study the various muscular action. I am handing these out as the way they are. And so I did mine at home on the ping pong table, dissected it. So it came time to bring it in, and he walked up between the rows of students and to grade each one and send his frog over to the center. He said, "Okay, Madden, not too bad. I'll give you an 89. Well, I accepted it, of course. So Bill Ryan, a classmate, was yet to be checked with his frog. He was way down the front on the other side. And he said, "Okay, Ryan, send over your specimen." Well, he had asked to look at mine, so he just used mine as a fake because he had used something that his mother used to clean clothes that would eat the meat of a frog. Well, what Bill didn't know was it would also eat the framework. So he had nothing to work with. So he needed a frog. That's why he wanted to just look at my frog after it was graded. So along comes Bugsy, and Bugsy looks at it. "Rather a meaty specimen, Ryan. I'll give you a 72. So that took care of Mr. Ryan. So we got our education, though, and they didn't take any nonsense. I remember the prefect of discipline, J.T. Boyle, S.J., a mountain of a man. If he found somebody doing something they're not supposed to do, the favorite comment, "Take your books, go home, and don't come back." I never forgot them. And you didn't mess around with J.T. Boyle. So anyway, in other words, it was a hard and fast private school, and if you didn't shape up, you were sent home. That's it. So that tended to make you a better student, and that did help me. And unfortunately, I couldn't continue with it because it was interrupted in World War II.
You mentioned earlier about some of your experiences with Jesuit prefects at Marquette High.
Yes.
In your time here. What was your opinion on the amount of Jesuits that were working at the school and quality of the job they did?
Well, my understanding was it was part of their training. I think it was 2 or 3 years they would put in teaching. After they'd have a certain amount of training, they would just walk in as laymen. And the only one that gave me trouble was one night when he gave us all, the assignment was to read 100 pages. Now we take other subjects besides history. So I labored my way through that. Now it's midnight and I got to do my math and I got to do this. And I didn't read all the book, which he found out when he asked me a question. And I said, "Sir," you always called them sir. They were known as scholastics. And I said, "Sir, I did not have time because of your assignment of 100 pages, I didn't have time to do my math homework." And he didn't like that. And he was kind of mad at me. But that was my closest thing I came to a clash. Otherwise, you did what you were told, believe me. I don't think that's probably changed here.
It's definitely still like that.
Yeah.
You do what you were told.
Well, it all depends on, and that's the root to a lot of teenage problems today, I think. They weren't brought up strictly, and I mean, you did as you were told, and that was it. And I think that helped, because I wasn't much of a student when I came to Marquette High. So, but anyway, I was exempt from Latin for the final exam, so I must have done something right.
So what was your relationship like with your sisters?
Well, there were 2 different types. Pat couldn't wait until she read the reaction of John Lee during the day, which is why I wasn't able to sit down much when my father came home and meted out the penalty, whacking my rear end. And Marge didn't say anything. And Marge wound up, got married out in California, wound up with 9 kids. And Pat wound up in West Bend and Her husband worked for Westman Aluminum, but they were two. We got along pretty well, but once in a while Pat and I snarled, but not Marge. Marge was a lot more gentle. She's the only one with a college degree. So anyway, that's the way it worked.
And then what was your relationship like with your parents?
Well, my parents, we were raised strictly. My mother wasn't quite as strict as my father, but I know I can give you a good example of one thing that was not too bright that I did. We lived in a house on 66th Street that my bedroom was on the second floor, and I could open a window and walk out on a roof on the first floor that covered a nice big porch at the front of the house. And it was Halloween. And what you do, Halloween, you do things like sticking pins in doorbells so that it rings constantly. We were told to stay home, don't go anywhere. Well, I had been what's called was naughty, so I was assigned to go to bed without supper. That's how it was. And so I'm up there and I thought, I think I could make some water bombs. So somewhere or other I learned how to make a Christmas tree ornament. It was sort of an octagonal shaped thing out of stiff paper, a little hole at the top. You filled it with water, and you could take them out there and lie down belly first and look straight down and see people coming up the steps to your house. And I thought, gee, I could drop some bombs on people. So my father and mother had good friends. The man was the Marquette basketball coach. And he and his wife were playing bridge with my father and mother, and I'm out on the roof, and three girls start walking up the steps, two of them side by side and the third following them. And they're going up the two steps, and it was perfect, and I was directly over them. So I dropped a bomb, and one of the girls in the front ranks, it landed right on her shoulder. And for some reason I thought about, someday I could probably be a bombardier. This should be fun. And this thing came down and landed right on her shoulder and exploded water all over her. Instead of looking up from where the bomb had come from, she wheeled around and started a tirade on the girl who was walking behind them. And she said, "Darn you, I'm going to get even." She said, "I didn't do that. It came from up there." So they all three look up there, and I'm laughing up on the roof. And, all this caused some shouting and yelling. My father came to the door to see what was on. Well, they left, the girls left, and said, "We have brothers, we'll be back." My father heard that. He said, "Okay, get down here, Johnny. You are on Mr. Chandler's car on duty, and you don't allow any nonsense, soaping windows or doing anything." Well, they never came back. But that's the kind of thing, sent to bed with no supper. Did you ever hear about that these days? You don't hear about that. Well, I don't know if you even hear about spanking, but you hear about it, all right, and you experience it. But anyway, it didn't hurt. Here I am. So I made sergeant in the Army. I must have done something right.
And is there anything else you would like to say about any of those childhood experiences?
No, except that my parents were right. They raised me right. And I think I have said that's the time today. I think the people, I don't know if it's Switzerland or somewhere over there, there's some country, I don't know if they still do it, but I always thought that was a wise move. When you were a teenager, at a certain age, everybody went in the Army. And you taught neatness and hanging up your clothes and doing as you're told. So that made them favorite, they were not so loose as they are today, And I think that's our problem today. But anyway, not that I was a perfect. Look, I had the encounter with a police force in Dodge County, no license, 10 years old. So I didn't catch hell for that, though. My grandpa just got a laugh out of that. My grandma, when we got home, "Wait till I tell your Uncle Morris," my dad's brother. I said, well, he was a traveling salesman, and he stopped in to see us folks all the time. Grandma told him the story. I said, you can tell Uncle Morris, but whatever you do, don't tell his brother, my father. So,
in our pre-interview, you mentioned that your grandmother nicknamed you Jack.
that's right.
What was your relationship with her like?
Well, she was pretty sharp. She was more like her son, but she wasn't quite that strict. But she brought me up in the faith, as did my father. We went to members of St. Bernard's in Wauwatosa. And well, for example, to see a sister of hers out in Sioux Falls, I was telling JJ, I mean, to take me along, that's a 500-mile drive, you know. Why would they take a kid along? But she wanted me to see her brother. So she was very likable. And she said she's going out to play bridge this afternoon. And she said, here is a prayer I want you to memorize. And it was the act of contrition. And I said, oh yeah. I said, when I was going to Jefferson School, you went down to St. Bernard's at 3:30 in the afternoon once a week to religious instruction. But anyway, we were just starting with that prayer and before we took Holy Communion. And she went out to play bridge, and she came back. She checked me. Did you learn that prayer? Yes, Grandma, I did. And I repeated it. So she watched my. I got along with my grandparents. We had a good time. I'll never forget with my mother's brother. He was the inventive type. He took a Dodge Coupe called with a rumble seat, which is a trunk lid which reversed, and you could sit in the back. And that was their version of a convertible. And he extended the body so he could carry a cow. He liked to deal in cows. He had his own pasture. So he's carrying a cow who's thrashing around in the back. You can imagine the wheelbase of this little coupe. And he had a hired hand that worked with me once in a while. So here I am, little John Lee, sitting between these two adults. We're going up a gravel road outside of Fox Lake. And he shifted down, and the car's going slower. Suddenly, it stopped. It stopped because the front wheels had left the gravel road. The cow was thrashing around in the back, and it was too much weight in the back, and the hill was too steep. I was terrified, and Grandpa was not. He said, all right, Georgie, you get out. John Lee, you get out, and till we get this straightened out. Georgie, I want you to sit on the front bumper. So Georgie went to sit as a counterbalance. I ran down the hill because we were going to go over backwards and be killed. This is the end. And just a little kid, you know. And so anyway, things like that. Like my mother, she was full of the devil just like Uncle Petey. She decided to take her father's car, called a Kissel car, built in Hartford at the time, and she had found out that outside of Fox Lake was a big hill up above the river, and it was frozen over. So she talked two of her girlfriends to go with her for a little ride. She drove up the hill. Here was a funny road going down the hill right out onto the ice to the other side. And she had previously checked it out. So they're all shrieking, the two girls. She went down that hill like a shot and got on the ice and slammed on her brakes and spun around. So that was her fun. The other thing they did, my grandpa kept a herd of deer in the pasture. Why, I don't know. And they decided it would be fun to irritate the deer. I said, irritate them? Weren't they mad? And she, oh yeah, they got mad. After a while, they just got fed up with it. And we played the first person to get to the fence where there's the big ladder and gets over the fence wins. And I said, well, what happens if they caught you? Well, I got my hind end pounded. It ran up and stood up and just beat a tune on the back of me. And I'm lucky I wasn't killed. So that's how they made their own fun in Fox Lake.
In Fox Lake, you also mentioned there was a motorcycle story.
Oh, that was the best. Sunday afternoon in Fox Lake, you went in the park on the river that led into Fox Lake itself. And people like my folks would come out from Milwaukee, and we'd have, a picnic lunch there or something. But all of a sudden, one day, some young kid was shouting, "Look out! Everybody get away from the river! Here he comes!" And you heard this tremendous roar. What it was a motorcycle. And I never did hear who it was that did this. But he came down the road to the river, shot across the dock on this pier, and went right in the river, astride the motorcycle. So everyone is gasping, who is that guy? Why, he's crazy. And he was never seen again. He wasn't seen because he had a big rope with him, and he swam underwater into a nearby boat house and dried off in there, and no one ever saw him again. And but he did it again one other time. I don't know how that motorcycle, to me, a hot machine like that, I would think it'd be cracking apart or something, but I guess they made them pretty tough in those days. But there was, I think the police, the marshal for the town, gave him a strict, no more of this nonsense, you're scaring people. Just forget that. There was a guy that was a musician, a favorite person from Fox Lake. His name was Bunny Berrigan. And he played for some band. He had a band, and that was the only famous one I ever heard of. So the population of Fox Lake was 1,000 people, and all four of my grandparents lived in town. They didn't live on the lake. So, but that was pretty good summers I had there.
So you mentioned earlier about how your grandparents really influenced your faith life. So how important was religion to your family when growing up?
Well, on my father's side, very, very important. And my grandma and grandpa, Madden. On my mother's side, grandma and grandma Pettigrew, they're the Protestant faith. But so it was a little different deal. I don't know how they did it then, but so the mother finally did convert, and so Dad informed us of that when we were growing up, and he had her convert. So.
And you talked earlier about a parish that you went to. What was the name of that again?
Where was that?
A parish you went to.
Oh, St. Bernard's. That was in the village of Wauwatosa.
Okay.
Yeah, and we lived on 66th Street.
And what was the community in that parish like?
Well, we were pretty young then, and the only thing we noticed was it was a little hard kneeling down. There were no padded pews. There were no padded kneelers. And I remember a neighbor of ours, Tom Berry, you'd see him with his brother and his parents, and he felt bad for his mother because she had bad knees. So he was always clutching a pillow for her to kneel on. I thought that kind of touched me, and to teach you to have respect for your parents, So being young, there were a lot of things we didn't know about organizations because we were too young.
So is there anything else you wanted to say about your early childhood that you say would formed you as a person?
I think the best thing I did was go to Marquette University High School. That's what I think. And because of Nick Gagliano, he talked my father into sending me here, and I think that was the most outstanding thing that happened in my life. Both my faith and keeping it anyway.
And flashing forward to when you settled down with Elizabeth, where did you guys end up moving to?
Well, and that's probably the main reason I got married, because I felt bad for her because she lost her father, and then she lost her mother. So she wound up living there alone. And that kind of got to me. And I'd given her, for Christmas, let's see, I gave her, she just got a new car from my father, but she held back on things like radio. So I gave her a car radio for her Christmas present. And I gave her, next year I gave her pajamas, and she thought that was very strange. And finally I just bought a ring and put it in a box and gave it to her, you know, and then she could do with it what she wanted. So one day we're driving down the street, and she said, say, she'd do things like, cause she'd go by the jeweler, we'd drive by a jeweler, say, oh, it looks like they don't have too big a crowd in the jeweler. I think she was hitting. And so one day we're driving down the street, and she said, hey, you never asked me to marry you. I said, okay, will you marry me? She said, yes. I said, okay. So we were on the way to see my friend Dimberg. He was at a suburb in Milwaukee and on a river, and he was having a ice skating party. So we go in there, and my friend David Dimberg noticed, she sat down that she was wearing it. He noticed this ring. He said, gee, that's a pretty ring. Did John give you that? And she said, yes, he did. He leaped up, ran over, and threw himself down on the floor like he's having a fit. And his wife said, David, what ails you? And everything stopped. There must have been 10 people there. What's wrong with David? And Marilyn said, well, you don't know John. He's been going with this girl for some time. And so she got everything calmed down. And, but David took it. It was a terrible shock. David went into World War II as a Navy aviation cadet. He went through flight training, and when he got out of flight training, he found out they were being assigned to torpedo bombers. Your lifespan does not go on much longer if you're flying torpedo bombers. They fly in low and slow. They were sitting ducks. What does he do? He resigned from the program. So they sent him to the psychiatrist, and he wound up showing training films. As my father said, nobody ever dropped Dimberg on his head.
So as far as your adult life goes, where did you guys end up moving to?
Oh, well, she was always interested in houses. And we got married in June of '68. And she's always looking on Sunday afternoon, looking at different places, and I just went along with her wherever. And we came across, in Menominee Falls, we came across this new subdivision that was going up. And so that's how we wound up out there. And so we were there 50 years. So, and then I lost her 10 or 11 years ago. So I'm living there alone now. But I have a daughter, and so things worked out. And I am glad I got married, and it worked out very well. And the only thing is, my daughter watches me like a hawk, but she's a big help. Thank God I've got her. She's in her 40s now.
And thinking about your time in Menominee Falls, were there any places that were really special to you, or that you thought were really cool in the community?
What are you asking about? What?
About like
For amusement, or?
Yeah, for just general entertainment, or you liked.
Oh, well, right about now, when I moved in, I wasn't doing much like that because I was busy in the funeral business then. And but now I go with some retired people, and they call it Romeos. Retired old men eating out. And the first Tuesday of every month we meet at a bowling alley and we get together, and I usually sit with the doctors. There's some doctors there that I play golf with, and so we have a good get together, having lunch there. But as far as any other amusement, like I didn't do any bowling or anything. I played golf with the doctors. That was my hobby, really.
So is there anything else you would like to say about your time in Menominee Falls once you got married?
No, I think it's a wonderful neighborhood, and there's a great bunch of people. Of course, there have been changes. People have come and gone. And we're in a dead-end street, and it's quiet, and We have great neighbors, and I'm glad we did it. I'm glad we did it. I would never think about building a house or anything, but my wife was a teacher, and she decided she wanted to build her own house, so we did. So that's the way it worked.
Okay. So, thank you, Mr. Madden. That looks like all the questions we have today.
Okay.
Thank you again so much for interviewing with us, and we'll be in contact with you soon.
Okay.
Thank you.
You did a good job.
Thank you.
I hope I did.
You did a wonderful job.